Hi, welcome everyone. So I'm Agustin Rayo. I'm the Associate Dean of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. And I'm very excited to be here for our fake news event. So some very brief words about the Manus America initiative, which this event falls under. So Manus America is a non-partisan project to try to talk about the social, political, economic issues of our time to the MIT community, to bring experts on these issues, to talk to the MIT community. That's the men's part. And the Manus part is to find productive ways of addressing these problems. We have all sorts of interesting events. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out those links. So today we're going to talk about fake news. Our speakers are Sinan Aral, who's a professor at Sloan, and Soroush Vossoui, who's a postdoc at the Media Lab. Did I pronounce it right, the French way? Oh, good. And their research is amazing. So part of what prompted all of this is a paper they recently published in Science, which does the following. So everyone is talking about fake news and how it spreads, but they actually work out how it spreads. So I'm hoping they'll tell us more, and I understand that Sinan will do the speaking. After that, we're going to open it up for questions. And I want to ask people who would like to ask questions to come to the front and use one of these two microphones, and to start by just introducing yourself, and if you're a student, or if you're faculty, say from what part of the institute you're from. So, with no further ado.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, guys. So, what I thought I would do is just to speak for a very brief period of time, just to give you a sense for what this paper is all about and what we did, and really focus mainly on having a conversation. So I actually don't think that the paper is all that complicated, especially for MIT students and people around the MIT community. I can't speak for Soroush, but my guess is that for both of us and for our co-author, who I'll introduce when I get to the paper, this is nowhere near the most complicated paper that any of us have worked on or written. It's really just a descriptive paper that asks an important question. And I think that that's why it was published on the cover of Science, not necessarily because it's complicated in any way. So I'm not going to try to make it any more complicated than it is. I'm going to try and just describe it to you as briefly and as simply as I can. And I want to try to make this 2 hours about a conversation, because I think that there are so many important questions that we could ask and try to answer as a community and as a group that this paper opens up, rather than questions that this paper answers and closes down. And so I think the conversation is going to be a lot more interesting. So we wrote a paper called The Spread of True and False News Online. It made the cover of Science on March 9th. And myself and Soroush Vossoui, who's here with me, is going to sit on the panel and answer questions and have a conversation. And our collaborator and co-author, Deb Roy, who's an associate professor at the Media Lab, and has been Soroush's advisor during his PhD studies, and Deb and I both supervised his PhD and his postdoc as well. Just found out on Sunday that Soroush got his first job offer at Dartmouth in the computer science department as an assistant professor. So congratulations for you, Soroush. There are many more of those to come, we hope. A couple of outstanding schools that he's waiting to hear from. So let me tell you what we did and what we found, and then we can have a conversation about it. So by our estimation, and based on all of the papers we've read so far, this is by far the largest longitudinal study of the spread of false news online that we've seen. So what we did was we collected all of the fact-checked rumor cascades that ever spread on Twitter from its inception in 2006 to the end of 2016, so 10 years. So what does that sentence mean? All of the fact-checked rumor cascades that ever spread on Twitter. It means that we went to a bunch of independent fact-checking organizations and took down all of the stories, articles, blog posts, anything that they had ever fact-checked over the 10-year period of observation, and use those stories as the baseline of the corpus of true and false information that we'd be looking at. So Snopes, PolitiFact, Fact Checker, Urban Legends, and so on, these organizations meticulously fact-check things that are being claimed in the news and on the internet and so on, and they have a corpus of stories that are labeled as true or false or mixed, where mixed is partially true, partially false. So we pulled down anything that was ever fact-checked by these organizations, and then we went and looked for mentions of those stories on Twitter, and I'll describe for you how we did that in just a second. So these organizations agreed on their labels 95 to 98% of the time. So that gave us the initial corpus of the verified true and false stories that could be spreading on Twitter that we would then go look for afterwards, okay? What we did to find the stories was we went to Twitter and we looked for any mention of one of those stories, and then we worked backwards through a cascade, which is a retweet chain on Twitter, all the way to the origin tweet that started the conversation, and then worked backwards and built up the cascade of any retweet from that origin tweet. Now, a story can obviously have multiple cascades because more than one person can independently mention a story that's been fact-checked. So for every mention, we worked backwards to the origin tweet and rebuilt the cascade. And for every story, there could be one or many cascades spreading on Twitter. So in the end, we collected 126,000 cascades spread by approximately 3 million people over 4.5 million times. So 6 independent fact-checking organizations, and you see the names of them there, and they're agreeing 95 to 98% of the time. So a couple of descriptive graphs just to show you what I'm talking about. So these are counts of all the true, false, and mixed cascades that are spreading on Twitter over time, with annotations to well-known or canonical examples of the stories that are contained in any given spike. So for instance, in the last spike there, you'll see news about the 2015 terrorist attacks in Bataclan, in the Bataclan nightclub in Paris. And you see Boston Marathon bombing stories there in 2013 and so on. Red is false, green is true, yellow is mixed. Mixed is the fact-checking organizations have labeled them partially true, partially false. They contain some true information and some false information. If we look at just political stories, these are the count of just political cascades. You see a couple of interesting notes in the data. You see a spike during presidential elections, and one notable spike there, which is the largest spike of mixed news that ever spread on Twitter in these 10 years, which is during the 2 months of the annexation of Crimea, which is itself an interesting story. And if you want to know more about that story, you'll have to read my book, because that's how my book opens, which is what is going on in that mixed news spike during the annexation of Crimea. So we went and dug into that specifically to try and understand how that might be working. Here are the different categories of stories that we're looking at. By far, more of them are political. We have urban legends, business, terrorism and war, science, technology, entertainment, natural disasters. Okay? So how did we measure news diffusion? This is what a cascade looks like. I'm sure you can sort of visualize it in your mind. Somebody tweets the origin tweet, and then a number of different people retweet that tweet or retweets of that tweet, and you get a cascade. Any cascade any story that is tweeted in multiple different cascades will have many different cascades. We measure essentially 4 different characteristics of these cascades. The depth of the cascade, which is how many hops from the origin tweet does the cascade travel. The size of the cascade, which is essentially the number of users. We break it out into unique users and so on in the paper. The maximum breadth of the cascade, which is the number of users involved in the spread at any depth. So 1 hop away from the origin, 2 hops away from the origin, 3 hops away from the origin, and so on. And structural virality, which is essentially a measure of the degree to which the spread is due to peer-to-peer sharing of the information or a broadcast. The greater the structural virality, the more peer-to-peer it is, and the lower the structural virality, the more broadcast it is. Okay? This is just a couple of images depicting true and false cascades that are spreading on Twitter. The cover story of Science, the cover of Science is actual data from our paper with a true and a false cascade. So that's the image you saw at the beginning. And let me just quickly run through the results so we could get to the discussion. The main result of the paper is essentially that false news diffuses farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information that we studied, frequently by an order of magnitude difference. Here you see a lot of those results: cascade depth, cascade size, max breadth, structural virality. And then we look at some of these, for instance, over time, over depth, and so on. Okay? False political news travels farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than any other type of false news. All of these differences are obviously statistically significant. And then we tried to understand why. Okay, so the main result of the paper is that false news is spreading farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly. And then we want to sort of understand why. The first set of questions that we asked about why is, well, we thought maybe the characteristics of the users who are spreading false news are different than those who are spreading true news, and this can explain the difference between the spread of true and false news. So you might conjecture, for instance, that people who spread false news, maybe they have more followers, and maybe that explains why false news spreads more on Twitter than true news. So we looked at how many followers, how many people they followed, how active they were on Twitter, how often they were verified users of Twitter, and how long they had been on Twitter. And in every case, the opposite was true. So people who spread false news have significantly fewer followers, follow fewer people, are less often verified, are less active on Twitter, and have been on Twitter for less time. So false news is diffusing farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information, frequently by an order of magnitude, despite these characteristics, not because of them. So this couldn't explain the differential diffusion of true and false news. So then we built a model that predicted the likelihood of retweeting true and false information, controlling for all of these factors and other factors. And what we found was that false news was 70% more likely to be retweeted than the truth on average. Okay? So then we were wondering, okay, well, if it's not the characteristics of the users, what other explanations could we think of? So we were reading about Bayesian decision theory and information theory, and we were reading papers in the sociology literature about status, and we read a couple of things. So we read that novelty tends to attract human attention. Okay, this probably comes from our visual cortex and processing that we want to be able to see if, a lion pokes his head out from the bush, and, that novel information is useful to us if we want to, run away and save our lives. And somehow this what's new in my environment has sort of crystallized in our brain, and you see lots of neuroscience papers that describe the value of novelty attracting human attention. Watching images, reading text, thinking about different types of information, and so on. We also read studies about Bayesian decision theory and information theory, which demonstrate that novel information is significantly more valuable for decision making, because the redundant information isn't likely to change your behavior or your actions in a way that changes your outcome. It's novel information that's likely to be more valuable in changing your behavior in a way that changes your outcomes and what happens to you. And finally, we were reading sociology papers about status, which showed that people who share novel information gain in status because they're seen as being in the know or having access to inside information. So when you share things with your friends that they didn't know, they sort of say, oh, wow, like Sinan must have some sort of inside information, or he's well-versed in that, or he's got some access to knowledge that I don't have. So we thought maybe novelty was an important factor that's associated with the spread of false news. So what we did was we looked at how novel false news was compared to the truth. And the way we did that was we took the corpus of all of the tweets that you might have seen in the 60 days prior to seeing a true or false incoming tweet, and we used information theoretic measures of novelty to ask, how novel is this incoming true or false tweet compared to what you've seen in the last 60 days? So imagine this is a person in the middle of a false news or true news cascade. Here's the origin tweet. They see that origin tweet, and they're deciding whether to retweet it or not. So what we did was we took this person, we look at all of the people that they follow and all of the tweets that they might have seen, and then try to estimate how novel is this incoming tweet that they see compared to what they've seen in the last 60 days. Across 3 different measures of novelty, we find that false news is significantly more novel than the truth in terms of these information theoretic measures. Now, that's a rigorous way to measure novelty, but that might not be too surprising to you, right? Because it's just easier to be more novel when you're making stuff up. When you're unconstrained by reality, novelty is much more available to you, right? So this just sort of confirmed the novelty hypothesis for us. But we weren't really satisfied with that, because this is some highfalutin information theoretic measure of novelty, but it's not clear from this that the people are perceiving it as novel, right? It's not clear what people's perceptions of the information are. So what we did next was we analyzed the replies to true and false tweets to try and understand the emotional perception or state that somebody might be in when they see true or false tweets. And we did that by looking at a fairly well-known lexicon that translates text to emotional sentiment that is contained in that text across 8 different emotions. And we used natural language processing techniques, a variety of them, including latent Dirichlet allocation and other vector-based methods and embeddings. And what we did was we looked at these 8 different emotions expressed in the language used in replies to true and false tweets. And these emotions were surprise, disgust, fear, anger, sadness, anticipation, joy, and trust. And what we found was that in reply to false tweets, people significantly more often expressed surprise and disgust. And this sort of, again, confirmed the novelty hypothesis for us, in the sense that not only is the information more novel, but people are expressing surprise in reply to false tweets much more than true tweets. For true tweets, people were significantly more often expressing trust, joy, anticipation, and sadness as well, which is a little bit more borderline in terms of its significance. Okay? So another explanation for why false news might be traveling more, and one that you see in congressional testimony in the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, is bots. That software, automated robots, are spreading false news, and they're the reason why false news is spreading. So what we did was we used 2 state-of-the-art bot detection algorithms to find the bots in our data. And we removed the bots, we put the bots back in, and we reanalyzed the data to see how is this spread being affected by the presence of bots. We did that in 2 ways. First, we removed any bot tweet. And second, we removed any bot tweet or human retweet of a bot tweet. So any branch of the tree that began with a bot or just the bots. So we essentially are doing this in 4 different ways, 2 different bot detection algorithms, and either removing only bot tweets or bot tweets and any cascade that continues from a bot tweet. And then we pull them out, put them back in, do the same analysis, and see what's the difference in the spread. And the conclusion from this was that indeed, bots were accelerating the spread of false news online, on Twitter, but they were accelerating the spread of true news at approximately the same rate. So they couldn't explain this massive difference between the spread of false news and the spread of true news. And the conclusion from that, unfortunately for us, is that human beings are a lot more responsible for the spread of false news online than we might have previously thought. Okay? Now, we can get into the discussion about whether troll farms, those are human beings, and our bot detection algorithm is not going to pick those up. Obviously, Robert Mueller has indicted the Internet Research Agency and 12 Russian citizens for running a troll farm out of St. Petersburg, so we can have that conversation as well. You do see here that this is the bot likelihood score on the left for all accounts, for all tweets, and on the right for true and false tweets. So you do see slightly more prevalence of bots operating on false tweets than on true tweets, but they don't explain the differential diffusion of true and false news online. I'm going to end with one final note, which is that we did a lot of robustness checks, which I'm not going to go through. But I will explain to you one robustness check that I did, which I think is very important. So one concern that we had is that we're getting all of our information from the fact-checking organizations, right? There could be a significant selection bias in that all of the stories that we're following are ones that were fact-checked during those 10 years by either Snopes or PolitiFact or FactChecker. That can create a selection bias because they may choose particularly salacious stories or stories of a certain type that are more likely to spread than normal stories would. It could also be a problem if fact-checking itself causes the spread to accelerate. Once things are or causes the spread to slow down. If it affects the spread in any way, that selection could affect the results. So what we did instead, so the main data set was 126,000 cascades. We collected a second robustness check data set, a 10% sample, which were never fact-checked by any of those fact-checking organizations. And we had 3 independent fact-checkers, undergrads at MIT and Wellesley, fact-check those articles manually. And then we reran the analysis on this robustness data set, which was never fact-checked by any of the fact-checking organizations, and all of the results held in that subsample that we used to deal with the selection bias issue. We went through lots of other robustness checks, which I'm going to refrain from talking about because that's sort of getting too into the weeds. And I'll essentially stop there and say there are lots of different avenues that we could take this conversation. For example, what are the consequences of false news in society? For example, what are some of the potential solutions, and what does the research look like on those solutions? What are the key linchpin concerns that all of those solutions might have, and so on? and we can talk about any other topic that you guys are interested in, including Cambridge Analytica, Mark Zuckerberg testifying in front of Congress, all of those. We've been thinking a lot about those as well. They're all wrapped up in a very similar set of topics. So it's totally legit from my perspective to go broad in the panel side. So with that, thank you guys very much. I'm going to invite Sarush to come, or you're going to start? Or?
I'm going to start.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you guys, and we'll do the panel. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm a second-year MBA student. My name is Schmear. I have the opportunity to help moderate this panel. So I'm going to start off. How it's going to work is I'm going to start off with a few questions to Sarush and Sinan, and then we're going to open it up to you guys. I know there's a ton of questions, so I get to warm up the crowd a little bit. So, okay, great. Well, first off, thanks so much for that fascinating talk. I know there's so much out there. I was telling Sinan and Suresh that I feel like I'm in the midst of a celebrity because they're like on the New York Times these days, TechCrunch, CNBC. I actually had a class with Sinan last semester, and I see him as much right now as I did last semester when I was in his class. So I'm excited to be here. So I wanted to start off with a question about the scope of the study, and specifically on the false news aspect. Do you have any idea of how much of the news consumed by the general population is this false news that you studied, and the impact on our consumption and the way we interpret it and take in news?
Yeah, that's a good question, which we really can't answer. So to be very clear, this paper is not a census of all news or information that people consume by any means. It is simply an attempt to estimate the differences in the spread of true and false news, starting with a corpus where we can feel confident that the true news that we're following is true and the false news that we're following is false. And so that verification step is really important. There are, obviously when you look at those numbers, you immediately understand that this is a small fraction of the total number of tweets that happen in a given day or a given year. It's a small fraction of the news articles that are published every day by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other outlets. So the answer to your question is basically, with this data, we can't estimate the amount of false news that is being consumed or not consumed.
Okay. I'm feeling you might have a similar response to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. This was done with Twitter data, obviously, right? And there are a lot of social media platforms where we all consume our news. Do you have a sense, or have there been comparable studies with other social media platforms? And what were the results from those? So.
Well, as far as I know, this is the first study of this size, basically very comprehensive, 10 years worth of data. So no, there hasn't been a study like that on other platforms. People have looked at spread of false and true information on Facebook, for instance. Actually, the Facebook data science team, internally they have looked at that, and they published papers related to that, but nothing in this scope. And also, as you know, Twitter is publicly available data, so the kind of research we do can only be done with publicly available data, because otherwise you either need to be working for the company to get access to their data, or you need to be scraping data from these platforms, which a lot of times actually violates their terms of services. And so this kind of research can only really be replicated on publicly available platforms like Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, one note to add, we definitely need a lot more research. Yeah. Facebook needs to make their data available and transparent for this kind of research. And by the way, they are. I don't know if you guys know, but they have just announced a commission that is going to make lots of data available to academic researchers that are interested in researching the effects of Russian interference on election outcomes, the spread of false news, and so on. This is led, or I should say, the model for this was developed in part by Gary King at Harvard and Nate Persily. And they are creating an academic industry consortia that is designed to make data like this more available instead of being locked up in the halls of the platforms themselves.
Is there, on that point specifically, because I've watched a few of your interviews, and I'm always struck that you mentioned at the end of the interview, there's so much more work to be done, right? And this is just a beginning step into this field. How do you rate and evaluate what the responses have been from these platforms, like a Facebook, like a Twitter, like a Google? How have they done so far? What should they be doing? You mentioned just an initiative just now on understanding the impact on elections. What other things are they doing? What other things do you think they should be doing?
Well, I think Sinan mentioned this in his talk, but our lab, the Laboratory for Social Machines at the Media Lab, has a special relationship with Twitter. That's how we were able to get access to the full Twitter historical archives. And so as part of this relationship that we have, we recently started looking at certain steps that the platform itself can take, not for misinformation specifically, but in general to improve the conversation around, political issues or any other kind of issue on Twitter, make it healthier, to improve the, the health of the public sphere, basically. And so I know Twitter is definitely interested in that. And actually, I don't know if you saw Jack Dorsey tweeted about this last month, where they have this initiative where they are asking for people to submit proposals to, for ways to study the health of the public sphere using Twitter data. So that's what Twitter is doing. In terms of other platforms, Sinan mentioned what Facebook is doing, and these are the two kind of initiatives that I'm aware of. And I think a lot more could be done by these platforms. For instance, one way these platforms could help dampen the spread of misinformation, for instance, is to make it easy for people to understand the quality of information that they're seeing, right? Like if you're seeing something, does it come from a high quality source or not, for instance, something like that. They haven't done that yet, but I feel like some of these platforms have started to realize that this is an issue that needs to be tackled, and I think they're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the more transparency, the better. We need more. I do feel like Facebook and Twitter have taken a couple of steps recently that are admirable and in the right direction, and I highly encourage them to do more of that. They are all facing a very difficult set of questions right now. This is something that I've recently been calling the transparency paradox, which essentially means that on one hand, they're facing this tremendous pressure to be more open and transparent, right? We want to know how your algorithms work, how the trending algorithms work, how the ad targeting works. We want to know how our data is being used, and so on and so forth. And at the exact same time, they're facing tremendous pressure to not share data. How could you share data with Kogan and then he gave it to Cambridge Analytica? You got to lock your data down and you got to make sure that nobody sees it and so on. So on one hand, they've got this pressure to be transparent. On the other hand, they've got this pressure to be secure. And really, their challenge is to thread this needle and to be simultaneously more secure and more transparent at the same time. That's a very, very difficult thing to do. But this consortia, for example, is a good way to do that, right? This is a way to, in a secure way, share data that can then make what's happening on these platforms more transparent.
So I'm going to leave the Cambridge Analytica questions, but I feel like the crowd might have some of those. But on Facebook, Twitter, social media platforms obviously aren't the only stakeholders in this picture. There is the role of traditional media, there's journalists, there's us as consumers. Maybe this goes into the solutions aspect, but what are all of our roles, and what can we be doing, and what can journalists be doing to not have this spin out even further out of control?
You want to start?
You want me to start? Okay, yeah. I think there's, and I think this is a longer conversation. I think each of these stakeholders has a responsibility. So consumers need to be more educated and act more responsibly. Journalists, although most journalists are actually take very seriously and are well trained in how to deal with, how to fact check, how to get to the truth, and so on. But I think, at the fringes of journalism, there's sort of a loss of that in some sense. I think, obviously, lawmakers have a responsibility to do what they're trying to do now. I'm not sure how well equipped they are. The testimony of Christopher Wiley in the UK and Mark Zuckerberg in the US was a little bit hard to watch, because it was sort of like your grandmother and grandfather saying, oh, well, I poked my niece on Facebook yesterday. Did you target it? I mean, it was sort of kind of like a deer in headlights on both sides. And so I think while they are responsible and are sensing their responsibility, I also sense that they do not fully have their arms around the issues that they're thinking of regulating. So I think that in terms of regulation, I think overreaction would be would in this case actually be a lot worse than underreaction. I really hope they take their time and they educate themselves and talk to a lot of people and really think through these complicated issues before they make any knee-jerk moves. I think this is a very complicated conversation. This is not just about misinformation, but it's about privacy regulation, it's about antitrust, it's about a lot of other issues simultaneously. You have multiple different global regimes that are developing. Europe is implementing the GDPR next month, which is a very strict data privacy regulation, even stricter than they already had, which was already strict. China is on the opposite direction. It's essentially state-sponsored surveillance with scores for every individual that will be tied to what your interest rate is, and so on and so forth. It's sort of in completely the opposite direction. The United States is somewhere in the middle, I would say, and is still thinking about what to do next. I do believe that what U.S. lawmakers do next will have a significant impact on both citizens' social welfare, privacy, and also the economy and a lot of other things. So I would hope that they're deliberate. If there's one thing they're good at, it's being deliberate. So I would hope that they're deliberate and that they take the time to really be well educated before they act.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. I think, as Sinan said, education is probably the correct way to address this problem. Educating people in terms of what to do, how to be deliberate when they read something, to make sure that they're not spreading something that's false. And like I said, I think the platforms can actually play a role in that by providing tools built into the platforms that allow the users get a sense of whether what they're seeing is actually true or false, and whether it comes from a trustworthy source or not. That, I think, is the right way to address this problem. What I'm really against is any kind of censorship, either by the platforms or through regulation. So I don't think, for instance, and I don't know if Sinan would agree with this, but I don't think false information should be censored and not shown. I think it should just be shown as it is, but provide tools for users to understand what they're seeing better, educate them better. And I feel like, as Sinan said, if there is an overreaction, and maybe there would be some regulation where the platforms are forced to maybe modify their feed so that news articles that are deemed untrustworthy would be shown, or not shown, or maybe shown at the bottom of the feed, or anything like that. I'm against. And like I said, what I'm for is just more tools in the hands of the consumers to help them make better decisions.
I mean, I think it's interesting on that point. I was actually listening to one of Zuckerberg's interviews, many interviews these days, and he brought up this issue where taking trusted news sources, and I think a little bit counter to what you're suggesting is making them a little bit more prominent, or having them come up closer to the news feed, top of the news feed. Not censoring, but it's a very fine line to do that. And I think he acknowledged, at least in that interview, that's the toughest challenge they face. The spammers, the state actors, those are ones that they can work with. It's these trusted news sources, these blogs, these free speech. What do you do with that? So I think it remains to be seen. I wanted to move to, and I think you mentioned it at the end of your talk, were some of the solutions. Maybe you want to touch on those briefly, and then have the audience can kind of probe and ask more details.
Yeah, sure. So the first thing when anybody asks me about a solution to this is that we don't know enough. Like you said at the beginning, I've been trying to tell everyone that we need to know a lot more. We need a lot more research. But I think that there are a few things that, or categories of solution that might be relevant, okay? So one is the solution set that Soroush was just mentioning, which is more information, transparency, and education about what you're consuming. So let me give you an analogy. When you go to the grocery store and you buy food, it's extensively labeled. You know exactly what you're consuming, how many calories it has, how many grams of sugar, how many trans fats. You even know how it was produced. Is it organic? Is it produced in a facility that produces wheat or peanuts if you have an allergy? All of this is on the label. And when you're consuming that food, you know what you're consuming. When you're consuming the news, you have no idea what you're consuming. How true is what I'm reading? How often does this source produce true or false information? How many independent sources does this organization require to run with a fact? Is it 1? Is it 3? How many reporters worked on this story? How many people did they interview? How long did they work on this story? You don't know any of that. You're just told the end result, which is, here's the news. This is what we found. So labeling or transparency or information, as Soroush was describing, I think is a really important one. Another one is incentives. So there are a number of different types of incentives that are affecting the spread of falsity. There are economic incentives. So if you read about the Macedonian fake news complex, there wasn't really a political motive in the creation and spread of false news there. It was an economic motive. What they found was that they could simply make more ad revenue on false things that they built and distributed than they could with true stuff. And that is partly echoed in our results, that stuff spreads farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly, so they made more money that way. So if that's the case, then disincentivizing the economic incentive might be one way. Now, that's going to get into the whole censorship issue that you guys were just talking about, which is that Soroush is against, obviously, banning voices on these social platforms for questionable content. Now, there's obviously limits to that as well. The Communications Decency Act of 1996, Section 230, says that these platforms are pass-through organizations, which means that they're not responsible for what people say on their platforms. But a new law that was passed in Congress just a couple of weeks ago says that that is not sufficient to defend someone for posting advertisements for sex trafficking on these websites. So where do you draw that line? Is that something that should be censored or not? If that should be censored, then is there anything else that should be censored, and so on? Those are case-by-case debates that I think we as a society are going to have. I support the anti-sex trafficking law which is censorship of people who want to put ads for sex trafficking on these platforms. Is there a blanket room for anti-censorship? I think it has to be case by case. Now, when it comes to disincentivizing, who gets to decide? Is it Facebook and Twitter that get to decide? When you are talking about disincentivizing, as in your response to Sarush, you said you heard Mark Zuckerberg and you think it might be a reasonable way to think about promoting things that are trusted and sort of limiting the spread of things that are sort of either malicious or tend to be false and so on. If that were done through algorithmic means, that would reduce the economic incentive because the sort of ad payoff would be minimized. Because less people would see it, less money would be made, right? So you have labeling and transparency is one, economic incentives is one, regulation obviously is another. You have lots of different regulatory means there. You have antitrust, you have privacy regulation to protect the use of personal data, and you have regulation even about truth and falsity. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that, but Malaysia did just enact a law that imposes a 6-year prison term for people caught spreading fake news, okay? Now that's very, very dangerous because it could simply be used to suppress opposition voices, and it could be a tool of repression. You're going to, how many times a day does Donald Trump say fake news? If everybody he calls fake news went to jail for 6 years, we would be in an authoritarian state in a hot minute, okay? So CNN would be the first to go. So that is a law. That is a regulation that exists in the world today in Malaysia. And the question is, what are the consequences of that regulation? Is it good or is it bad? In addition, I think there is algorithmic solutions, right? So technical solutions, models that predict false news, labeling bots, other types of technical solutions that we could get into more details. And then finally, sort of more education about the topic, which can take a number of different forms, civic media education and so on and so forth. So there is a whole landscape of potential solutions, each more complicated than the last, that need to be studied and debated and researched and so on.
So I agree with pretty much everything that Sinan said, and I think another way to address this problem is through behavioral intervention. So for instance, if let's say if you can detect when there is a false news article, an article that contains falsity that's spreading, if you can detect that in real time, could you, for instance, get to people before they're exposed to the falsehood, tell them that something is false and that they haven't seen, tell them that this thing that they haven't seen yet that they're probably going to see in their Twitter feed in the next hour or so is false, and show them proof that this has been fact-checked and it's false, and see if that has an effect on them retweeting the falsehood. So like my hypothesis is that, it could be wrong, but my hypothesis is that for a portion of people, if they're exposed to the truth before they see the falsehood, then they're less likely to spread the falsehood. And so running these kind of experiments to see if there are ways to combine algorithms. So in order to do that, you need to have a very sophisticated algorithms that could detect spread of false news in real time. Combine that with certain strategies to then intervene to dampen the spread of false information. I think that would be a really interesting area of research, and one that I know Sinan and I are both interested in working on.
Okay, I think I'll just finish off with the last question, and then we'll open it up. Just maybe on a more personal note, how has the reception to your paper been? You've talked to numerous media outlets, potentially some lawmakers, these platforms. How's the response been? Just any takes on and where you see you guys self going forward?
People are scared. The response has been essentially, overwhelmingly positive in the sense that people liked the study. They had been disappointed that most of the studies that they had been seeing were one-off studies of a single, rumor spreading and so on. So to see something comprehensive was good. We've had lots of questions about the research. Oh, do you claim causality? Does novelty cause the retweets? Tell me more about the bot detection algorithms. How reliable are they? And we've had a number of deep scientific conversations, which we encourage, and hopefully we'll have a lot more of those because that's really what needs to happen next. And I think that in terms of where we're going next, Suresh and I are both actively interested in, and we're going to collaborate on what can we do about this. So Suresh was foreshadowing a few of the studies that we're already building now, experiments to test how different interventions could help stem the spread of falsity and measure to the extent that we can how different types of interventions would dampen the spread of false news.
I think it would probably get even more attention. So that would be really interesting. We're going to open it up to questions now. Like was mentioned before, just come down to the mics, state your name, please be concise, and a question, and we'll open it up there.
My name is David. I was a student here. I've been back as a visiting scholar for a number of years. Two interesting points that I think I'd like to make a note, and your thoughts on it. The second one, which is not as important as the first one, relates to what is a fact. There's a lot of gradation about how you determine one and state, is this defined a fact, and therefore it's factual. Big area, it's a very significant difference in distinguishing that. But more importantly, as a neuroscientist and a psychologist, a number of studies have been done on the use of adjectives and adverbs in how children and adults perceive the truth of a statement. And when you look at journal articles, magazine articles, and journalists and people on television who speak on what is the news, you count up, and I wonder if you've ever thought of this, count up factual news versus not factual news, and what kind of adjectives and adverbs are used to create something that somebody wants to spread it. If it's disgusting, the worst thing that ever happened, the guts were on the floor, well, that's a fact. But then a person's human reaction, part of our brain isn't just rational, it reacts to emotion. And that, I think, is a substantial thing in trying to determine how things spread. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Great questions, both. So I was asked this question about facts about 2.5 hours ago in a conversation. So this is a very, very important question. I don't have a great answer for you. What I can say is that I do believe that if we can delineate a threshold between facts and opinion, then some of these other conversations are much more viable in the sense that I feel more comfortable labeling facts as true or false than I do opinions as true or false, right? And so, I've heard a number of different things that are in terms of defining facts. One of them that I've heard that may be something that we could hang our hat on is statements or claims that are verifiable and verified. Now, then that begets the question, what is verification? Okay? Verification itself is a whole conversation, right? I mean, whether you're a nuclear scientist and you're trying to verify adherence to a certain treaty, or you are a journalist trying to verify a statement that somebody is saying, or you're a court verifying, a deposition, that's a whole nother conversation. But maybe facts have to do with being verifiable and verified. The second part of your question is absolutely fascinating in my mind. When I look at the news today, I say to myself, where's the news? Because it's essentially just opinion channels, right? It's essentially just punditry. There's very little news in the news anymore. I agree that the adjectives used by news organizations are designed to be attention grabbing because that's a business model, right? So I hadn't heard this. I would love to actually get citations for research about how the adjectives used affect the perceptions. I would love that. I would appreciate that. Yeah.
Just a really quick comment on late is that everybody in this audience is presumably very intelligent. And MIT students, who I know very well, have an incredible ability to say, yeah, but, seeing both sides of things. Highly educated means not intelligent. That's not the average human being who is persuaded by adjectives and adverbs.
I would just say, as you're walking out, that that's exactly why the two issues of falsity and persuasion and micro-targeting are so related, right? Because if I can micro-target, then I can actually direct things, persuasive messages at those who are more susceptible.
Yeah. Well, he's leaving, but I can still add on to this. So the one area of research that I'm really interested in is looking at, kind of related to what you were saying, looking at news articles, let's say by the New York Times, over a 20-year span, and sentence by sentence classify whether that sentence is an opinion or a fact. Like if someone talking about something as factual, or is it an opinion? And plot that over a span of 20 years and see if over time the same news organizations are, and my hypothesis is that you'll see more and more opinion being weaved into the facts. And I think we can actually quantify that using natural language processing techniques and just kind of show that articles over the last few decades have become more and more opinion-based and not factual. So that's one area of research that I think might be of interest to you. And the other thing relating to adjectives, there has been research done on spread of tweets, and specifically looking at the language used and whether the language has an effect on how many retweets a tweet gets. So there are certain factors that you would think have an effect on something being retweeted, like how many followers you have. These are pretty obvious things, but there's been research that shows that the time of day that you make the tweet, obviously that has an effect on whether that gets retweeted, but more importantly, the language you use has a huge effect on something getting retweeted. Even if it's the same thing that you're saying, but using different adjectives, you can get very different results. And that kind of confirms what you're saying about the adjectives, yeah.
So on that point, was novelty the only quality you guys tested for how it spreads, how things spread?
We looked at novelty, we looked at the 8 emotions, and we looked at bots and the role that bots played.
Oh, cool.
And the user characteristics.
Oh, yeah. And obviously the user characteristics that I mentioned, followers, followees, verified, length of time on Twitter, activity on Twitter, and so on.
But novelty was the one you guys found was strongest, one of the strongest.
We didn't compare the strength of the two because some of them, they're harder to compare. But we found that novelty explained false news was more novel and false news was more likely to be retweeted, but all the user characteristics went in the opposite direction, that more followers and so on should be helping true news spread rather than false news.
And just to add on, as Sinan was saying earlier in his talk, when it comes to novelty, we're looking at correlations at this point, so we can't really make a causal claim yet. We are hoping to, in the future, actually see if there is a causal relationship between novelty and spread.
Hi, my name's Court Chilton. I work at Sloan. And I keep reading about how we're all sort of devolving into tribes and we're all listening to whatever's happening in our bubble and not to what's happening in other bubbles. So I'm wondering if you know about the research, or if there is any research that talks about causality. If I see a certain amount of fake news, am I persuaded by it, and then persuaded to change the way I would have voted if I was living in this bubble, versus how many fake news messages do I need to see and believe to be caused to do something, buy something, go out to vote, talk to others, whatever?
So the short answer to your question, if you're talking about false news, is no. I haven't seen any studies that convincingly argue a causal effect of false news on any outcome. I haven't seen that. But there are studies that show that whether microtargeting, for instance, how much effect microtargeting has. There are studies that look at the causal effect of persuasive messages on changing behavior. Everything from adopting a product, clicking on an ad, quitting smoking, lots of different studies like that. I think the next step is to understand, to do those kinds of studies for false information and to see how much of an effect it can have. And also to not just be, not put on blinders and think that false information is the only thing that can be effective or deleterious here. Thinking about foreign election interference, micro-targeting of true news could also affect an election. And foreign actors, we have laws that prevent foreign actors from doing that. So that could also be a concern as well. I don't know if you have other things.
No, I think that covers it.
Hi, my name is Zinzit. I work in communication with an African organization that it's a think tank program that looks into transnational crimes, and it's a collaboration with Interpol and the European Union. I'm curious whether in your research and in this 10 years of data and in your research about research, whether you've come across explanations or insights into the why fake news exists and the economic, political, or social reasons behind what's driving, which I assume there is a variety of reasons for, but I'm curious about what you've come across. Thank you.
So we didn't look at that in this study, but I can speculate as to why. I feel like just from looking at the data, and again, this is speculative, but there is false news that's maliciously created to serve an agenda. So let's say to support your political party or your position or whatever. So there's malicious false information. There is false information that's created for economic reasons, like the example that Sinan gave with the Macedonian false news farms. There is false news that's created just to get, just to get more hits on, not necessarily economically, so that you get more followers. You get, you have more interesting stuff to say, so you become more socially influential on social media. So I feel like looking at the data, these three categories explains most of the false information that I've seen, with one exception, which is false information about real-world events. A lot of those are mistakes by witnesses or like people being on the ground and thinking that they saw something and going on Twitter and talking about it. For instance, during the Boston Marathon bombings, there were a lot of rumors spreading, and the rumors didn't really fit in any of these three categories. They weren't spreading maliciously, they weren't spreading because there was economic reasons, and they weren't spreading because people were trying to get more followers. They were spreading because they were just mistakes in eyewitnesses, testimonies, or like if you remember, there was a case of a missing Brown University student who was on Reddit. Actually, there was a witch hunt, and they thought that he was responsible for the event, for the bombings. It turned out that he had nothing to do with it. But the reason people were talking about it is because they were listening in on police scanners, and they thought they heard his name. So it was an honest mistake, but it caused a huge, actually the biggest rumor cascade of the Boston Marathon bombings, and caused a lot of trouble for the person's family, and so it was a big deal. Reddit had to apologize after. If you remember, the CEO of Reddit actually released a statement after the Boston Marathon bombings about this. So I feel like these four categories defines most of the false news that I've personally encountered.
Hi, my name is Ann Stewart. I work in communications at MIT. Before I came to MIT, I was a journalist for about 30 years, newspapers, magazines, and websites. And I was actually going to ask about what Sarush just addressed, which was the role of errors. Because I noticed, and I also teach journalism communications elsewhere, and what I've noticed is just more and more and more mistakes, which are sometimes corrected and sometimes not. But I wondered if that factored into your research or whether you're planning to look at it. In other words, someone was sloppy, but maybe not malicious, maybe not, having an intent, but negative intent, but doing something that I frankly wouldn't have gotten away with myself during my own career. So did you address that at all?
Yeah, so great question. And, just I would reiterate Sarush's point that this is a significant portion of the false information is sloppy errors. But let me make 2 points that I think are relevant to that. The first is that the correction never has as big an effect as the actual error. So when you publish the actual error and it goes viral and everybody hears it and so on, and then later you write a blog post as Reddit and you say, oh, I'm really sorry, but that was an error, a tiny fraction of the population that saw the error and cared about the error sees the correction, which is a big problem. The second point I'll make is that I think that the sloppiness that you're describing is directly related to the economic situation that publishers find themselves in today. So when the internet came about in, at the turn of the century, a lot of publishers faced a very significant business model challenge. Like the New York Times went to an all ads-based newspaper, and it wasn't sustainable. Now they're trying to claw back their sustainability through a subscription model, and they continue to work on that model. They're having some success. They haven't completely pulled themselves out of that problem. Long-tail publishers, even worse. So the internet created this awesome, what I consider to be really good for our information diversity and our information ecosystem, this long tail of publishers that publish blogs and smaller journals and so on. Those try to sustain themselves on ad revenue, but that model is very difficult to sustain. So what happens? Newsrooms have to cut thousands and thousands of reporters and fact checkers and people who are going out into the field and so on. And now you have this skeleton crew trying to keep up with a growing amount of news events around the world. And they just have less time to be more accurate and to be more, and this is a direct consequence of the disruption of the internet and the effect it had on their business models. And I feel like these are very important issues to our civil society for exactly the reasons that you're describing.
I just wanted to ask one other quick question, which was about kind of the role of media literacy. Because one of the things that I've noticed, and again, I don't teach at MIT, I teach at another school, but undergraduates, especially in some of my classes there, don't distinguish between, for instance, an anonymous blog post and the New York Times, or an anonymous blog post and the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I just wondered if that's something that you think needs more attention or if that's part of your solution.
Yes, definitely. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned earlier in terms of the platforms, for instance, providing tools for people to understand, the quality of the information they're seeing, including, whether the source of the information is, a trustworthy source like the New York Times or some anonymous blog. I feel like that could actually be part of the education process. Because if you're on Twitter 24/7, let's say as a teenager or as a young adult, if this is built into the platform, and as you're seeing the news articles from New York Times and these anonymous blogs, you'll be actually being shown what is trustworthy and what is not, then I feel like that would definitely help in getting people to better understand which sources, when to be skeptical and when not to be skeptical, which sources to trust and which sources not to trust. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Raman. I'm a postdoc in the Institute for Medical Engineering. I was just wondering if you, this may not be totally trivial to do, but if you could compute the information capacity of the channel that you're looking at, because Twitter might just be a bad channel relative to others.
Could you say more? What do you mean by channel?
So-
You mean Twitter itself or individuals with
No,
followers?
no, I'm just
or-
saying, like, can you actually compute like the capacity of like how fast, like the maximum rate at which you can transmit information with arbitrarily low error rates, right? So can you compute that given the data that you have so that I can tell how good that Twitter is as a channel for propagating information?
I mean, it, it sort of depends on what you mean by error rates. I mean, you
Well,
know,
a false, like a true news article, and then as it propagates through the circuit, it eventually comes out as error, right? As a false news, versus the probability of it staying true towards the end. If you understand what I mean.
I don't. So what I have in my mind is a channel, an individual's channel on Twitter depends on how many followers they have, how many people they're following, and so on, in terms of their capacity to transmit information and to see it. And I don't understand the concept of a true article turning into a false article. I don't, or true information turning into false information, or error. I don't understand that.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess it's more like if you know an event happened and you know all the details are you're fact checked, right? And that's your input into this channel, which is your origin of your cascade.
Yep.
And then at the end of the cascade, you can see what's the number that are stay to be consistent with all the fact checks, right? As the signal propagates through the cascade.
Oh, I see.
You see what I'm saying? And then
I
you
see.
have one, or you have a bunch of branches. Do you understand what I'm saying?
So,
Okay.
so you have a piece of information.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know its veracity
Well,
until it's fact checked.
yeah.
It's an article. It has many facts,
Mhm.
maybe, and it's going through, and then
Mhm.
you know it's becoming fact checked, and then it's known to be either true or false, and everything else is noise. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, basically. But I mean, you can in principle then compute something like how good this channel is, right?
I don't think it's just a function of the channel, unfortunately, because the whole verification process is happening outside the channel itself, right? So there's a number of different parts of the ecosystem that are contributing to that rate that you're describing. And it's
okay.
not just the movement of information through Twitter. It's public discourse, it's fact checkers doing their work and then contributing new information to that stream, which is
Right,
a link
okay.
to a fact checking organization and so on and so forth.
Okay,
So
okay.
I'd have to think about how I might do that.
Okay,
Is
thank
there a reason why you'd be interested in knowing that quantity?
Well, I mean, it's if someone could tell me like, here's a number for the information capacity of Twitter, and here's a number for the information capacity of newspapers, and it's just higher, then it's going to be. It's better than someone telling me that Twitter's a bad channel to get my news from, right? It's an actual number I can look at. Do you see what I'm saying? So yeah, it's useful, I think.
Also, just to make a point, on Twitter, people usually, at least our cascades, are all retweets. And when you retweet something, you don't change the original content, right? So there is no, so let's say if there's an article, you retweet it, you're retweeting that article. So
Yeah.
there is no chance for the article to go from false to true,
Okay.
or like
Okay.
true to false, you know?
Well,
So there's no noise in this cascade?
No, but we would have to think a lot more about that, because it's not just retweets that matter, right? So a reply to a retweet with a Snopes link could dampen the cascade, even though it's not part of what we call the cascade. It's another action that is complementary to the cascading information that then dampens or
Right.
accelerates the spread.
Sure.
That is linked to a whole nother process, which is a fact-checking organization doing its work, and so on and so forth. So
Yeah,
I think it's it's complicated.
I'm sure it is. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Emily McLaughlin. I'm a first-year MBA student here at Sloan. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion with us. I just wanted to touch upon something that you mentioned earlier, but I was hoping you could go into a little more detail in terms of technical solutions to this problem. So you sort of mentioned bot detection algorithms or models that could in real time sort of track the spread of fake news. Could you go into a little more detail about some additional technical solutions?
Yeah, so actually my PhD thesis, before this paper came out, as Sinan mentioned, he was in my PhD committee, and my PhD thesis was specifically on that, which was to create a system that would automatically detect and verify rumors on Twitter as they were spreading. And my background is in machine learning and natural language processing, and so we were able to create a system specifically geared towards rumors around real-world events, like the Boston Marathon bombings. In fact, the Boston Marathon bombings was the reason why I started working on this problem, because I saw like the amount of the number of rumors that were spreading on Twitter about the event, and so I created this system for my thesis. It's 75% accurate, so for 75% of rumors, it can not only detect them but also verify them before any other fact-checking organization, right? So even though 75% is really far off, like it's not close to 100%, but it kind of shows that there is signal there and that there could be technical solutions that automatically detect and verify these things. And then what you do with that information, that's another thing, right? Like, so let's say you verify something to be true or false. What do you do with that, right? And this is where the interventions that I was talking about earlier would come in play, where once now you have the veracity of this thing that's spreading, what do you do with it? Maybe you want to target people who are on the path of the article, of the news. They haven't been exposed to it yet, but you can predict that they're going to be exposed to it soon, and then in a way inoculate them with the truth, so that when they're exposed to the falsehood, they already have the truth with them. But yeah, there are a lot of possible technical solutions. I wasn't the only one who worked on this problem. There's been a lot of groups who worked on automatic detection and verification of rumors.
Sorry, quick follow-up. So that's really interesting. But I also was wondering, because I watched some of the Zuckerberg hearings, and he talked a lot about artificial intelligence as kind of solving a lot of issues. Do you see tech companies, or at least Twitter and Facebook, actually looking into these technical solutions, or do you think they're still on the fence about it? Or I'd love to hear your thoughts about what they're thinking.
When I was watching that, I couldn't help but laugh to myself as this seemed to me like Mark Zuckerberg waving around the AI wand and going, "These are not the droids you're looking for," And all the congressmen were like, "Oh yes, okay, AI is going to solve this problem." I think that there are a number of different applications of. I don't think AI is the right term. I think machine learning is a much better term for this. And I feel like there are a number of different things that you could do. I mean, machine learning is designed to predict. So predicting whether something is true or false, predicting whether an actor is likely to be producing a certain type of content, predicting whether a certain type of content is likely to spread or not, predicting what the effect of that spread might be, and so on. You could imagine the types of things that Soroush is describing being applied to any of those questions. I think that Soroush is being very humble because, in 2015, he published his thesis, and he was accurately identifying true and false rumors spreading before anybody even fact-checked them, right? So that I think is pretty promising, given that that's a first step, and I think that a lot more could be done. And I sort of feel like, I don't think there's a silver bullet. And I don't think that AI is a silver bullet for this either, in the sense that, Soroush is right. The next question is, let's say you could predict any of that. You still have this morass of complicated things that I described a minute ago about regulation or incentives and so on that you still have to, that's an input to a solution. It's not a solution.
So you talked about some solutions revolving around giving users more information on their timelines or feeds about the source or certain quality metrics, but different platforms have different ways of sorting those results, right? And I think for Twitter, it's more of a timeline-based system, but for Facebook, it's more they do user engagement and they sort items based off user engagement. So if you're, given your research, which shows that the more novel something is, the more likely it's going to spread. In that model, and you also spoke about how it's probably not right to embed, to do like different types of sorting, because that could be another way of censorship. But would you not encourage those platforms which use solely user engagement and attention-based metrics to also incorporate some measures of quality and those same sources that you're also providing to users into those algorithms that do the sorting themselves?
Yeah, I think that's potentially a great suggestion. So just to clarify a couple of things. Twitter used to be reverse chronological only, but now they're also using engagement metrics to sort in terms of relevance for each user. I think that there is potentially a natural experiment there. Okay, so they went from one version to another, and we have data to see what happened before and after, so we could look at that. I think that it's a very difficult moral, ethical, business question to determine what should go into an algorithm to determine what types of information should be promoted or demoted. There's a lot of concern around engagement-based metrics because, well, for a variety of reasons. Okay, I think engagement-based metrics, I think, are a really horrible path for both socially and business reasons. Okay, so I'll give you the socially you can probably already determine for yourself, which is that the most salacious, ridiculous things get a lot of attention, and the stuff that maybe is more valuable to us doesn't, and hence your suggestion to include some value metric in what should be promoted or not. But it turns out it's also not a great business metric either, because although it's measurable, easily measurable, and it seems intuitively relevant, for instance, to an advertiser, it turns out that clicks are a horrible proxy for conversions. So clickers don't convert, converters don't click, and the correlation between clicks and conversions is really bad. So clicks as a proxy for how well my advertising is doing in selling my product is also bad. So advertisers should be just as up in arms as citizens should be about engagement-based metrics running our algorithms that determine what we see.
Good evening, I'm Gonzalo, second year MBA, and my question is related also to one of the hearing with Zuckerberg. So I have two short questions. One is, how far away do you think we are from coming up with this solution that Mark Zuckerberg described as AI, that is going to solve the fake news issues and some other issues in years or in months?
Infinitely far.
And the other question is, even if you can come up with that solution, do you think it should be implemented? And how are we going to deal with the fake, with the false positive and false negative? Because it's kind of Facebook saying this is true when it's not. Do you think that could do more harm than the fake news itself? Or do you think it should be implemented anyway?
I personally think having these kind of tools made available by the platforms is useful. But I think if platforms do label, let's say if they end up labeling things as false or true, I think they should be very transparent so you can actually understand why it is that they labeled it the way they did. So instead of just trusting their judgment, maybe they could have an option where you can actually click somewhere and see why that decision was made. But I do think, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about education and making tools available for users to better understand the information that they're consuming, having these kind of AI-based, machine learning-based algorithms that I don't personally like labeling things that false or true, but like labeling it as like high quality and low quality maybe, or or maybe like a quality score, so it's not very discrete, like one way or the other. But I think having those kind of labels would be really helpful for consumers, as long as the platforms are transparent about how they come up with these labels and scores.
I agree with Sarush, and just to clarify my flippant comment, I mean we're infinitely far from AI solving the problem. We're obviously not infinitely far from AI being able to accurately identify truth and falsity with more and more accuracy. I think we're going to get better and better and better at that. But that's just step one. That's the entry ticket to a solution, right? Then you have to figure out, you have to answer all these very difficult questions about, how should we label? Is it right for a platform to be determining what's quality and what's not quality? Should it be done through regulation? These are the hard questions. I think improving the accuracy of my model is the easy part of this job, right? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Qiwen. I'm working in MIT Center for Collective Intelligence as a visiting PhD student. My majority of studies in social network analysis, so I'm particularly interested in if there is a way to consider some social network metrics to identify those, for example, those susceptible and influential people in the chain of the spread of the fake news. So can social network metrics play a role in solving this problem? My second question is that, as you said in the presentation, there is a potential for people to tweet or retweet fake news to increase their influence or attract fans. So it seems that Novelty can influence the people's network position. So how will this interaction influence the diffusion of fake news?
Very good and difficult question to answer. I did publish a paper with a different co-author, Dylan Walker, who's at BU now, in Science in 2012, called Identifying Influential and Susceptible Members of Social Networks. And that paper devised a large-scale experimentation strategy that would get at the causal effect of one person's message on their network neighbor's behavior. It was about taking all of the messages that are spread from an individual to their neighbors and randomly blocking some of the messages and then measuring the change in behavior of people who were blocked and people who weren't blocked. Then you get a causal effect. Since the blocked messages are randomly chosen, there's really no in expectation difference between people who receive the message and people who don't. So that should be a fairly clean estimate of the persuasive influence of the message on a particular behavior. So that method is a general method for identifying both influence and, if you sort of reverse it, susceptibility to influence. We could do something like that here to try and identify the spread, influence and susceptibility in the spread of false news. You would need something like that to be able to make a causal statement. I mean, influence, the word influence is a causal statement. My action changes your behavior. I cause you to change your behavior. Susceptibility is also rooted in a causal framework. So you would have to have, if you want to do it rigorously, you would have to have some randomization procedure to infer a causal estimate either for susceptibility or influence. The answer to your second question is yes. I believe that there is a dynamic evolution of network structure and influence and susceptibility as it relates to the information that's being passed between people. Sarush's example of, people making fake news for the purpose of getting more retweets, for the purpose of increasing their stature in the network by getting more followers is the perfect feedback loop example of that. And so, yes, if you didn't think it was complicated already, it's even more complicated when you think about sort of bringing in network dynamics and everything else into the problem as well.
I'd just like to add one point to what Sinan was saying, which is in order to get a causal understanding, you do need randomized experiments, as Sinan said. And as you know, since you work on social networks, it's really hard to do randomized experiments in networks because then you have to deal with spillover effects and because people talk, right? You can't clearly have a control and treatment group. And so it's a very complicated problem, even from a kind of causal inference point of view. You can't use kind of standard methods that you use for other kind of randomized experiments to do this.
By the way, there's a whole literature developing on this violation of the stable unit treatment value assumption, which is this notion of the difficulty of estimating causal effects in networks. And that goes under the sort of more common term of statistical interference. So if you want to read more about designing, I have a chapter in a book called Networked Experiments that goes deep into sort of the statistics of, or it doesn't itself go deep, but it's sort of like a summary of all of the pointers to the literature on SUTVA violations and network interference and how you can design experiments to avoid network interference and so on.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Danielle. I work at Open Learning at MIT. I just had a quick question. So I've read some research that talks about when people have a belief in something and they're presented with facts that contradict that belief, kind of counterintuitively, their belief actually strengthens. So for example, people who think that vaccines cause autism, when they're presented, oftentimes when they're presented with facts that debunk that myth, their belief in vaccines causing autism actually strengthens. And just going on that example, the original study that was published, that kind of made that false assumption has been debunked for a very long time now, and yet that belief continues to, people still hold that belief. So I was wondering how your research deals with that, or your solutions to false news.
Yeah, you're right. I've also read that research that shows that, like you said, that if you already read something that's false, and if you've already read something that's false, and then you're shown the true version of that thing, you actually, in a lot of cases, become more entrenched in your position instead of changing your position. And I do think that what I was saying earlier in regard to interventions, I think it's really important to identify who might be exposed to falsehood and show them the truth before they're exposed to falsehood, exactly because of what you're saying, which is if they've already seen the false story, then showing them the true version of that story will most likely, it's very likely that it won't actually change their opinion. So that's why one of the intervention methods that I explained would be specifically looking at people who are on the path of falsehood but haven't yet been exposed to the falsehood, and then inoculating them, as I said, with the truth, so that once they see the falsehood, they've already seen the truth. And I think if you do it this way, I'm speculating here, of course, it's my hypothesis, but I feel like if you do it this way, the effect that you're seeing, a lot of it will go away. And so people will be less likely to believe the falsehood. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, that you have this whole process of opinion formation, right? And so Suresh is saying if you can get them early on before they have entrenched beliefs, then maybe you can, it's sort of inoculation rather than treatment, yeah.
Hey, Adam, former MIT employee. Used to work for Shoes Boss, actually. Let's see. So my question is actually specifically about the research. So the fact that novelty is a major correlate, possibly driver, it makes sense intuitively, a more emotional valence. At the same time, though, there's the intuition that falsehoods are just things that fit within our existing narrative, make more sense to us. They're more believable. So, on the right, we might think of something like Pizzagate. On the left, Monsanto being the source of Zika. I'm wondering, or my question is, in the course of doing the textual analysis that yielded the novelty result, did you guys see anything about the prior belief contents or anything like that of how people would be primed to spread or not spread messages?
So we did not look at that, no, but it'll be interesting to study that for sure. I feel like to really get deeper in understanding the role of novelty, you need to look at different categories of rumors and false information. My hypothesis is that for certain categories, maybe for certain type of political, information, maybe novelty is not the main driver. Maybe adherence to their person's belief is a bigger cause, but we haven't looked at that. So, but it's an interesting area of research. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think that's one that could easily be assessed with this data because, you have the corpus of things that they had seen prior, and you can try and understand whether it's the political leaning or the viewpoints that are expressed to them prior to seeing this, and the congruence of the false or true compared to what they've seen. So yeah, I think that's an interesting avenue for future research. Yeah.
I'm Dan Ross. I'm a spouse of a MIT employee. I'm trying to wrap my head around the idea that people would be getting information that they hadn't solicited or weren't used to reading. So if I'm a Fox News watcher or reader and suddenly before I hear the news from Fox, I get something from the New York Times that says, aren't I going to be just selectively blocking that out anyway? And we're someone said earlier, we're kind of all within our bubbles of how we prefer to, where sources we find reliable. And coming back to your analogy of the food labels, there's a lot of people who just pay no attention at all to the food labels, even though they should, and it's going to give them a healthier diet. But if they get a rating of 90% on something versus something that's 50%, are they going to care? Are they going to screen out the 50% and start believing the 90% if that's not within the bubble that they, are living in?
Yeah, I agree with that. Basically, if you don't have shared reality between these two bubbles, and shared reality could mean a lot of things, but one definition could be which outlets, which sources do they trust, right? So if you have one bubble that trusts Fox News and Breitbart, and then you have one bubble that trusts New York Times, and CNN, they don't have the same shared reality. And so depending on how you're coming up with that information quality score, depending on which bubble it's coming from, the other bubble is not going to pay attention to it, right? And so I agree with you. That is a problem. And I think dealing with fake news and false information we have to deal with it in conjunction with dealing with tribalism and polarization, and the existence of these filter bubbles. I feel like you can't just address one of the problems without addressing the other one. Your example is a really good. It really makes the point that even if you do come up with these scores, if you don't address the underlying tribalism, people are just going to ignore these scores.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think the fact that we have to address these things together is a really important one. That you have to address polarization and tribalism and false news at the same time. I would just add that the answer to your question is just that it's an empirical question. We need to do more research and see whether people and to what extent people and under what conditions people and what types of people ignore and block out or are actually affected by this kind of information.
Hi, my name is Ashley, and I'm a member of the biotech community in the surrounding area, and here as a guest of a member of the MIT community. So thank you for the opportunity to listen tonight and participate in the discussion. A lot of time has been spent talking about novelty and obviously the role that that's playing do you see, and we also have alluded to tonight, in terms of potential solutions, responsibilities of the tech community, not to point fingers or suggest causality, but obviously a lot of tech innovations are encouraging us as a society and as a population to become more and more novel seeking. Cell phones in our hands at every moment, constant desire to be scrolling, phantom scrolling, and the behavior that's being exhibited in small children. Do you see the potential, and do you see people advocating, based off of this research and other research, for more collaborations, that as more tech continues to be innovated, what type of precautionary measures are going to be put into place? And do you see the potential for more people in the neuroscience community, for example, the health scientists, psychologists, education specialists, et cetera, banding together to better address this? You alluded to it with the food industry, how there's, or say smoking, realizing the dangers and now no longer being able to use cartoons, for example, in advertising. Now with food, realizing the implications. Do you see the same thing happening with the use of apps? The dangers of continuing to use apps so often. How much does that make you susceptible to be an ingester of fake news, or perhaps even be someone who's going to have greater repercussions like drug-seeking behavior, other things that are based on the novel-seeking behavior system?
I'm just short way into a book that is on this topic called Irresistible by Adam Alter, which is about essentially the sort of psychological effects of screens and apps and so on, and how they're designed to sort of be addictive. I don't know whether that is going to materialize or not. I don't know whether, I do think that more and more technologists are aware and concerned about this. I think there's a great deal of backlash from even founders of Facebook and funders of Facebook who are advocating, deleting Facebook because of, of these things. I don't know if that's going to sort of catch hold. I think that the stream of innovation is going to be more tilted towards things that try to avoid that. But I don't think, I'm not sure that there's going to be some sort of universal coming together of the tech industry to self-regulate and or support regulation around making these kinds of things less addictive. Yeah, I'm skeptical.
One follow-up question to that, in terms of, you alluded to the economics behind a lot of this and the role that, say, potentially VCs or different people play in encouraging engagement type metrics, but then showing through your research that those aren't necessarily indicative of conversion, et cetera. And so are they the right metrics to be pushing companies towards? Do you think there's opportunity for more collaboration in the financial sector to encourage people to create less novel-seeking technologies, perhaps by pushing the fact that the end result might not be there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're already seeing some of that. There are pockets of resistance in the advertising industry, not just around that specific point, but around other things that are that need more innovation in the ad-driven business model. So Mark Pritchard, who's essentially the CMO of Procter & Gamble, has been on a tirade for like the last 2 years about the lack of transparency and the lack of effectiveness of digital advertising. The fact that ads aren't viewable, the fact that we don't know what the relationship to conversions is, and so on and so forth. And he cut $100 million from his advertising budget as a sort of put your money where your mouth is stance. You do see companies boycotting Google and Facebook and others when their ads are showing up against next to malicious or questionable content. So transparency around where the ads are being shown and next to what kind of content. Unilever just made a big splash by pulling back advertising dollars in the same way. So there are pockets of those types of actions, and I think that the digital marketing industry is going to have to evolve and innovate in order to be more effective and sort of better holistically as well.
In the case of malicious fake news, at the very beginning, someone talked about Cambridge Analytica. No one else has asked about it, so I thought I might just get you to, it seemed to spark you, so let's just go there. I'm appalled by them, but maybe I shouldn't care if it doesn't really have an impact, if there's no causality from what they do. It seems like it would degrade democracy if you're spreading a lot of false news and giving people bad information about candidates, but maybe it doesn't really have an impact.
I think the answer is we just don't know, right? So we just don't know enough, and we are, you know, it's essential for us to know. And so I think, you know, the moves towards more transparency by Facebook and Twitter and this consortium, and Twitter, you know, calling for more research and making data available. And, you know, I mean, it has to be said that, you know, Twitter was incredibly supportive and open in supporting our research with data, and, you know, they were always pro-transparency. So I thought that was admirable throughout the whole process. We can estimate, given the right data, what effect it had. We know that there are studies that were done about the effectiveness of very similar micro-targeting activities for the purpose of selling products. And what we found, I didn't conduct the studies, but what they found, what those authors found, what we as a society found in that research was that, yes, there were significant effects on persuasion, but the base rates were incredibly low. And so what's the overall outcome in changing behavior? It's a very significant effect on a very low baseline rate. So just to give you some numbers, the approximately 30 to 40% change in behavior upon receiving a micro-targeted ad based on personality traits for base rates of actions that are in the 0.0001 range, which means you're getting a 30% increase on a behavior that's happening 0.001% of the time. Okay, so is that scary? Well, when you put it in those terms, no. And then when Christopher Wiley testified in front of UK lawmakers, he claimed 5 to 10% conversion rates. Okay, that's a very different number. Do we have evidence that that's true? No, that's just a claim. I haven't seen any Cambridge Analytica experimental data or anything like that. That's a very wide difference between, you know, those two estimates, and those kinds of conversion rates are unheard of. So it makes me question the veracity of those claims. Although he did say in his testimony, these are unheard of, you know, and we had them, you know, so I don't know. So the answer is we don't know. We need to know. There is some evidence that gives us some understanding of how much or how little they're affecting. And by the way, then you have to know that's the average effect. Then you think about, okay, there is some evidence that there was a focus on purple states, right? So not everybody was targeted, but only those very close states were targeted. And if you go back to the Bush v. Gore election, it was decided by 500 votes and change in one county in Florida. So, you know, like, what's the answer? It could definitely have an effect.
Just want to add that I do agree with Sinan that we need to study this, but I'm also very skeptical about the claim that it had such an effect. I don't think it was, this is my personal opinion here, I don't think it actually had an effect on the outcome of the election. I think it's way overblown. Personally, that's what I think. But it needs to be studied.
We have a couple more minutes, so I think we're going to take one more question for now. If that's okay. If it's quick, then we can go on. But go ahead.
So I'm Flora. So you have ways of just evaluating the veracity of news. You have potentially ways of identifying if something is news or rumor or news or opinion. What about satire? How would you handle something like The Onion? Because like often on social media, you'll see people like share satire articles. Sometimes they'll share it knowing it's satire and their friends will know it's satire. Sometimes they'll share it and not know it's satire and think it's true. Or they'll be like, oh, this is so obviously false. And then their friends will be like, you know, this is satire, right? So how would you handle something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. For this study, because we looked at these 6 independent fact-checking organizations who investigates these stories, they never investigate satire stories. So they never investigate any stories from The Onion, for instance. So these things didn't make it to our data set, but I have seen instances of people actually retweeting or tweeting a satire article thinking that it's true, right? And so it's not part of this study, but that's a really interesting phenomenon, where especially if people are from other countries who are not familiar with some of these satire publications like The Onion, and sometimes they do get taken seriously, but it's not part of the study that we conducted.
So we should thank our speakers, and we should thank our moderator, Schmear, and we should thank Catherine Gammon and her team from Student Life at Sloan who made all of this possible.